Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of the Impact Planning Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson. I'm the Managing Director here at Impact Policy, and today we're joined by our Director, Policy and Research, Sean McCarthy. Sean McCarthy comes to us from a long background in the public sector, most recently in the Department of Planning and Environment, significant experience across Aboriginal affairs and a range of different portfolios, and we're very lucky to have him here alongside us, leading up a lot of the work we do in the research and policy world. So thought it'd be a great opportunity to get him on, pick his brain, and dive a little bit deeper into some of the themes that we've been going on throughout this podcast series. So Sean, over to you, brah. Let's kick off with who's your mob, where you're from, and give us a bit of background to how you found yourself here.
Thanks for having me on. I'm Sean. I'm a Gumbaynggirr Bundjalung man from Coffs Harbour, Grafton. Been living in Sydney for most of my life as well, just in Gadigal country in the inner west. You're a big part of the reason why I'm here. Obviously, you pulled me in. I love working with you at Aboriginal Affairs, but yeah, couldn't be more excited to start at Impact. I guess I came from the public service. Spent ten years as a public servant, and about three of those years were in the Department of Planning and Environment. So I had a couple of roles there, but I've worked in policy and I had a particular focus in relation to Aboriginal policy and looking at the planning legislation and economic policy side of things. So yeah, that's a bit of my background, and that forms the bulk or the basis of my background in the planning space.
Yeah, unreal, unreal. And you both you and myself spent a significant period of time in the Department of Planning and Environment here in New South Wales. In the time that we were there, one of the core values and principles was around embedding Aboriginal cultural knowledge into everything that they sort of do. And I think since this podcast series has started recording, they've now got the draft, the framework which was in draft is no longer in draft. It's now policy. The connecting with country framework. But I just thought, like, part of this journey with this podcast has been yarning with people like yourself around, we talk about like embedding Aboriginal cultural knowledge into the planning sector and the infrastructure and environment sort of spaces. And, you know, I guess what does that mean for you from a practical sense, from a cultural sense? And, how can people try and understand what that sort of means and what that looks like?
Okay, so I think that for me, it really means that there needs to be a genuine attempt at embedding that knowledge throughout all the different sort of hierarchical structures of planning policy and planning practice. If you look at, connecting with country, that's formative, that's foundational, and kind of centers everything that blackfellas do. It's the center of our culture in many ways. So if you're going to be embedding that within the planning system, you've got to have that same knowledge and intent to really center everything around Guri connection to country,
Mm.
and caring for country, and everything else flows from that or stems from that. Um,
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Have you got examples, maybe for someone who's listening, who's sort of new to the sector, new to the space, and they're really trying to understand, I guess, what that means in practice when we talk about um, caring for country and connection to country when they think about our mob, our communities, or how that connects to the planning and environment world?
I think, sorry, could you ask that again?
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah. No, look, it's a big one, right? So we talk
yeah.
about connection to country, caring for country, and all these other, I guess, ways of understanding how we can embed Aboriginal cultural knowledge. Is there a way that we can explain that for people that might be listening in terms of how they can help to support facilitating that or embedding that in ways of working or in policy and practice that's happening?
Yeah, definitely. I think that when we talk about connecting the country, you're talking about tens of thousands of years of cultural knowledge and a deep understanding of to a particular place, a deep understanding of how to care for that place, a deep understanding of how to nurture a particular area, and it's almost it's a spiritual connection, but it's a practical one as well. You
Mm,
look at fire management practices and other things like weirs and wares that were developed to replenish country. It's really multifaceted, but it's there's a practical element of that spiritual connection as well.
mm,
Um, So I think it's recognizing that within a policy setting or within a frame, recognizing that within a framework is difficult, but I think if you're looking at a distillation of what connection the country is, it's sort of that. It's using
mm,
country, it's talking to country, um, it's having that deep understanding of how to navigate it and how to care for it and nurture it and how that really it's a reciprocal sort of reciprocal relationship,
mm.
how it nurtures us, and that's built over 60 to 100,000 years plus. Um,
Absolutely.
so when we are talking about connection with the country, we're talking about that. That's that inheritance, that unbroken line dating back to
Mm,
your first ancestors. Um, and that's what blackfellas are sort of talking about when they mean that. So
mm.
um, yeah, was there
Yeah, absolutely. No, look, I think that helps people try and understand, how when they're hearing this phrase in policy or in reports or in ways of working to try and start to understand what that can look like in practice and I guess where I want to try and go to now is around engagement.
yeah yeah
So we talk about starting with country um, and that's critical, right? But we can't sort of really get to understanding what that can mean for different communities and countries without understanding and engaging appropriately with our communities. So I just wanted to have a yarn as well around what you sort of think when you think about Aboriginal community engagement in these sorts of planning sectors and what your experience has been like. Maybe when you've seen it done well, or when you maybe seen opportunities for it to have been done better. Any sorts of thoughts or feelings around that journey?
yeah. So I think often unfortunately, it's sort of done in a tokenistic sense sometimes, or done in a haphazard, ad hoc manner.
Hmm.
So it doesn't give Aboriginal communities enough time to respond adequately to what they're being asked, or to even get an understanding of, the complexity of the planning system and how that's actually
Mm,
applying to, an area of land that, they might care for,
hmm.
or, in the case of Laos, own. So I think there could be a lot of improvement in how you engage or how we engage through planning processes.
Mm.
Currently, I think there's about 4 weeks for a lot of matters for engagement or 28-day sort of period. And that's just not, that doesn't take into consideration what actually, well, I guess some of the barriers to engagement that different Aboriginal communities might
Yeah,
have.
absolutely,
Like
absolutely.
trying to one, just have a meeting with mob, consult properly amongst your own community
Mm,
about what this matter might mean, what a planning proposal might mean, the impact of that.
mm,
Trying to speak to the right people with the cultural knowledge. If there's something that affects a heritage site, for instance, or
mm,
another sacred site. If you're allowed, actually organising a meeting with a quorum of members and getting
mm.
approval from your board and all this other stuff. It's quite a lot goes into it. So it I
Absolutely.
think current processes actually put a lot of pressure on Aboriginal communities. Um, it's certainly burdensome to a lot of Aboriginal communities, and sometimes, that they're asked for to comment on matters that doesn't, in their own words, don't concern them. So
Mm,
some of
mm, mm.
my engagement, that was a big piece of feedback, and often the feedback centered around, the burden that the planning system puts on Aboriginal communities for things that they don't have an interest in. So it's not
Mm,
actually proposals that no, a planning proposal that affects their land or anything like that.
mm.
Sometimes it's just generic questions that could be answered otherwise, or it's really a scattershot approach to um to consultation and engagement. There's no thought about what's appropriate engagement or
Mm.
considered engagement, and um it's around. There's no real intent to co-design, from what I've seen in many instances. That's not that's not every instance. That's just
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
instances. But yeah, there's not that real element of co-design and that intent to collaborate. So yeah, and I think that there is a bit of a power imbalance and a lack of sort of recognition of the subject matter expertise that Aboriginal people do have, and that blackfellas do have when it comes to caring for country and for
Mm.
heritage matters and for a whole range of things, really, that I think could be properly teased out with a better consultation framework in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Bro, you touch on so many different points. I was just trying to jot down a few of them as you were going because I really think that some of them are really valuable for people listening to understand. Some of them are practice um, references that can help build their, capability professionally. But and some of them are maybe a bit more systemic or a bit more sort of policy shift level in terms of how these systems are operating. But even just that from a time, you touched on the time perspective, almost being described almost as tokenistic in the 28 days or 4 weeks roughly time period for engagement. And I think it's a real common theme throughout this whole podcast series is about how critical it is to have a sufficient amount of time for our communities. Um, I've just got someone calling on one of our colleagues' laptops, which is like surprisingly very, very loud. And I'm just going to pause 1 second and mute it. Just a moment. All right, I'm back. Thank you, everybody who's listening, for that patience. And luckily, I was talking off some notes that I'd made, so I haven't lost my train of thought. So, we talk about the challenge around time and the weight that that puts on communities. We know one of the biggest barriers right now with Aboriginal community engagement is over consultation and lack of coordination. And so our communities are saturated. Our communities are often burnt out and under resourced, and that impacts the ability to meaningfully engage and participate in these sorts of processes. So, if you're listening along and you're hearing some of these sort of practice reflections from Sean here, start to think about how maybe we can do this sort of stuff better. If you only have 4 weeks because of how that policy, gives you that 28 days to do that sort of work, then maybe it's about where you're working, investing in more of a relationship-based model of engagement with communities over the long term, so that it isn't like to quote, some of your references, Sean, like a scattergun approach to engagement. So that engagement with Aboriginal communities is an ongoing investment of resources, so that when this stuff sort of happens, there's an existing relationship that can be built on that can maybe minimize some of that risk of a tight time frame that might not be able to be shifted, not being so tokenistic and so burdensome on our communities. I think was a really good point that you sort of touched on that hopefully some people can take some thinking away from. Um, yeah. And then, like particularly as well, that last part, I've got a few points here, but when you make reference as well, I'm sure many listeners here and are conscious that there is a power imbalance between the public sector and private sector professionals and our communities. But that doesn't take away from the fact that our communities are very much subject matter experts. And so we're essentially like having an uncoordinated approach that really doesn't give the opportunity for our communities to be able to demonstrate and elevate their subject matter expertise really can put at risk, the potential impact that, planning, design, infrastructure projects could have potentially had alongside our communities because the engagement's, very surface level. Is that sort of in line with the references you were making?
Definitely, you've nailed it. It's and that's I think that's why it's really important to take this collaborative co-design approach whereby you can have a more balanced conversation. There can be more balanced engagement, and there's an outcome of engagement for that community. Um, that they get to build in. You can build into your approach their feedback and their expertise in a way that they're comfortable with. Um, and at the moment, that's sort of it's probably not prevalent in the planning system. It's more of a transactional relationship, and it's more of a ticker box exercise. So it's moving from that sort of gesture of like speaking to an Aboriginal community or organization or
Mm,
group and moving into more of a, well, let's look at this from a perspective of building strength into policy or building strength into approach and ensuring that our approach is more effective. And yeah, that's certainly something that I think probably needs to shift and is
mm.
probably trying to shift as well because I think that there's genuine intent, but the practice just needs to improve.
Mm,
Um, so
absolutely.
and like that's the case in pretty much every industry as well. So
Yeah,
um,
definitely.
and it's an ongoing process and never going to be perfect. But I think that's certainly where I'd like to see some level of shift as well
Mm,
in the next couple of years in the planning sector.
definitely. And I think there's some really critical and practical um, points for people listening to be able to take away in terms of, thinking about how they can embed that into their organizations or teams or their own ways of working. Are there any examples of where you've seen this sort of stuff done really well, where you can think of either policy or project or just engagement generally?
Um, yeah,
And
there was the um, I forget the name of the policy now or the engagement strategy, but it was uh, it was out west in Western Sydney. Basically, it was around a biodiversity conservation um, plan, I think it was.
Mhm.
Um, but it was certainly a co-design approach that was taken. So working with different stakeholders in that community and recognizing the different, I guess the different responsibilities that Aboriginal people had. So looking at
Mm,
the traditional custodians and their responsibilities to their country, looking at the Lauk and their multifaceted or the Lauks, I should say,
mm,
and the multifaceted sort of uses of land and responsibilities that they have, and trying to come up with a really collaborative strategy that encompassed all the needs and aspirations and um, uh, of a really needs aspirations and sort of desires and opportunities for like a really uh, diverse group of people.
mm, mm,
And I think the constant sort of you could see it in the design of the project. You could see it in the way that they continually sought feedback from groups and that it wasn't static. It
mm,
wasn't so it was an ongoing process built into this policy development or the development of the strategy and then from that, some really key actions arose. Sometimes, there's this uh, intent or wishy-washy sort of generic actions are sort of developed, but that wasn't the case here. There was some clear actions for government and investment opportunities and social and cultural sort of opportunities for Laux and for traditional custodians. And that was probably a part of the fact that they treated the Laux and Nguri communities as, I wouldn't say necessarily equals, but certainly it was a result of the co-design approach.
Mm.
There was more of an even keel in terms of the balance of power. So um,
Yeah.
I think that was a big reason for those distinct and quite distinct strategies to be put in place. So yeah, it was done. I think it was the Cumberland Plains
Yeah. Okay.
Conservation Plan. Now
Oh,
that I think of
shout out to the mob at Biodiversity and Conservation Trust that worked
it,
on the biodiversity plan. Sounds like you, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
good
they
level
killed
of
it.
cultural capability out there, doing some good stuff. That's awesome. One that's great to hear that, and great to think about the strengths because we often talk about some of the challenges, and it can be a complex space. But so to hear that and hear when it's done well, I think is really valuable for people to hear. I think one thing from a cultural and community perspective that you sort of spelled out with that Cumberland um, example is about how like our communities are not homogenous in the sense that like you can't just tick a box approach of one level of engagement or one aspect of engagement. You have to look at our communities in terms of potentially a range of different um, stakeholders and demographics within that community, whether it's the community in like broadly, whether it's traditional owner groups and families, whether it's the local Aboriginal Land Council, and that's often a first point of call that I've seen in the planning and environment sector is Laux. Um, but there's also a range of other stakeholders that exist within country where that work is happening that are just as equally as entitled to be consulted with and represented as part of development of that work as well. So I think what Sean talks to is a really good example of sounds like a country out there where I believe there's multiple louts that exist in where that work might have happened as well. Um, that may or may not have different interests or different perspectives around what might be happening on country there. Um, you've got mob out there. You've got mob from a range of different countries and nations that live out in those communities now as well as community and families that are connected to that place for a significant period of time, or as traditional owner families. So, already just talking, you start to see the breadth the breadth of what community engagement means when we talk about Aboriginal community engagement as part of this, which even just reinforces some of the key points that Sean's already touched on in terms of really doing this meaningfully and getting the most out of how this really adds value to the development of our work. Um, what are some of the like major learnings that you've been on, Bra? Because you know one thing that's important for people listening here that are maybe non-Aboriginal practitioners is like not all blackfellas have all the answers, and we don't all come into the planning and environment world being experts in how to do this stuff everywhere around this country. And so we are all constantly learning and building our own cultural capability in terms of how we do this sort of work as well. And so I just wanted to ask, like, what's some of the biggest learnings that you've probably had um, professionally in your sort of journey in this space?
Probably honestly, it'd be the structure of the planning system would be the biggest one. How it's structured from a policy point of view, and how that's hierarchical structure in place between the EP&A Act, the SEPs, the LEPs, and how that differs, how that allows for a degree of flexibility and how that sort of plays out in practice. So yeah, that's one of the biggest learnings. I think there's still a lot of work to do to embed Aboriginal culture within the planning system.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's uniquely placed because of that hierarchical structure. You
Mm-hmm.
could develop some, you could embed something into the EPA Act, that's reflected in a SEP, that's then reflected in LEPs. So you're ensuring that consistency at different LGA levels, or local government levels, or local levels, even though it might be like a statewide strategy or standard. I think the complexity of the work in the planning system, there's so many different types of land use and um, so many different people with uh, interests in land.
Mm-hmm.
So, just from residents to developers to government and different layers of government and other government agencies when it comes to infrastructure. Like, uh, so it's a really complex place to work at points, and can be quite um, difficult to balance the expectations of everyone, and often of such a diverse range of stakeholders. Um, I think I
If
think there's
yours,
probably a
if
lack of
you
awareness of
keep going,
the
yeah.
probably a lack of awareness with the of how to deal with blackfellas. So I mean, of how to
Mm-hmm.
communicate with blackfellas, and how to navigate consultation as well, which is a big one. Like when we were talking before about the different layers of community, the different interests of different groups, and you know, there's no sort of understanding that's even a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So the diversity of Aboriginal communities is probably a notion that's not really well recognised by the planning profession at this stage
Mm.
in New South Wales.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. It's a really critical point as well. I think we've talked a little bit around some of the, I guess, Aboriginal cultural education um, in the planning degree stuff for some other things that we're thinking about. And yeah, well, you definitely sort of see that in terms of the general intro to Aboriginal sort of education and its connection to the planning sort of space. And I think one of those things that's missing is, yeah, exactly what you talked to there. If one thing I was going to cut you off on, and I'm glad I did it because I think that's a really important key point that you talked to, is about, right, if you're the secretary or, DepSec of the planning sort of space, and you could change one thing that you think could have a significant impact for Aboriginal communities, is there something that sort of comes to mind that you'd put on your agenda?
That's a really tough question and a really good question. It's hard to nail it down to one thing, but I think what I'd love to see is probably a top to bottom evaluation or audit of the planning system and how it relates to our Aboriginal communities in New South Wales. Um, I think,
Mm,
uh, you know, you'd probably need a sense of what services are available, specific, like bespoke services are available to Aboriginal communities to allow access to everyone. What policy frameworks are currently in place? What
mm,
specific sort of policies are in place at the department? What strategies are in place at the department, or in the absence of that, where there are gap areas for those policies to be developed, we need to identify that.
mm,
Um, Probably looking at um, the representation of blackfellas in the planning system. How many is it in line with other industries? There's a dearth of Aboriginal planners. Why is that the case?
mm,
Uh,
mm,
it's not enough to say that blackfellas don't want to work in planning. You've got to delve into why they don't want to work in planning, or why they aren't working in planning.
mm,
Uh, Probably looking at development opportunities for blackfellas, and looking at a whole range of like consultation processes, even,
mm,
looking at something like a planning curriculum or planning degree, Um, why a
Mm,
plan is coming out of that degree with no understanding of what a LAUC is or what the Aboriginal Land Rights Act is, and
mm,
um, why a LAUC's being constantly stymied from progressing development opportunities. So
mm,
um, I think for me, if I was secretary, I would do a comprehensive audit of the system to identify areas that need to properly change
mm,
and to have that cohesive improvement across the board from the time that people come into the planning system as students, um, to the time working in local councils, to the department staff working with Aboriginal communities and developing planning policies. Um, I think there's a lot of change required, but for me, getting the evidence base and getting an understanding of exactly what needs to be changed and exactly what needs to be improved is key and essential.
yeah, absolutely.
Even
Oh,
looking at the duplication. So
mm,
you can
mm.
look at, streamlining things where they need to be streamlined and um, improving service delivery and efficiencies through that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's I think, really significant starting point, some sort of an evaluation. But from that perspective, we know that there's been, um, the last probably 5 years in New South Wales, we've seen a shift in terms of investment into, the or prioritising of engagement with Aboriginal communities, and the development of this connecting with country sort of framework is probably an example of building on some of that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it's probably time to consider in the last 5 years is investing in something like that looks at that. So if anyone's listening right now that works within Department of Planning and wants us to do that, please reach out to Sean so we can give you a hand and have a yarn about it. But yeah, so I guess that's a nice segue into thinking about people that are listening to this are probably listening from across the country in many different states that are working in the planning, environment and infrastructure world. But in New South Wales, we've, I guess, formalised the Connecting with Country framework in New South Wales. And so I've been asking a lot of different people, and I want to have a yarn with you, Bryce, about, I guess, how do you understand and consider that framework in terms of its relevance, and thinking, I guess, specifically about the impact that it can have for our communities and country and the planning sector. Um,
So I think
yeah.
the framework definitely tries to center, our connection with country and sort of make that explicit and make that um, kind of the overarching theme and consideration for all services planning or all policy planning. So I I certainly think that there's a world of good that it can create, um, and it's exciting and I think really positive that government or the planning sector is looking at embedding that, and actually having a formal framework around what that is. So yeah, I think it's a positive move. I think, I'm hopeful that it would really improve policy development, and really improve service delivery as well, and consultation processes. Um, I think it certainly does work at developing understanding and empathy towards Aboriginal communities. So
Mm,
you'd hope through that, everything else improves. Um,
mm.
but yeah, that's sort of my generic, high level take on it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're just hearing a lot of different questions from, people working within this sort of space now that that framework's live. Trying to understand how it's connected to their ways of working and how they interpret it as well. So I think, yeah, any sort of endorsement or feedback around the value of it is valid. And so, yeah, so if people are listening, they can jump on. We can put a link in the show notes to that framework and you can check it out in more detail. But here in New South Wales, the Connecting with Country framework really gives a bit of a insight into how any sort of development, planning, and infrastructure work should be happening in New South Wales, and how we start with that from a cultural perspective as well. Um, so if we've got non-Aboriginal planners and practitioners that are listening along, and they really want to impact their ability to engage and consult with our mob and our communities, have you got any advice in terms of where to from here? Like if they've heard you talking about some of this sort of stuff, and maybe they've got a project coming up that's Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal specific, have you got any advice around what they could do to try and build their capability a bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think first and foremost, don't act like a white savior.
Mm, mm,
But as an Aboriginal staff member working in the planning sector, that was one of the biggest frustrations. But it also shows a level of disrespect to Aboriginal communities and the capacity that they have and
mm,
their expertise that they have. I think if you are looking at improving your approach to this, be mindful of some of the barriers to engagement that Aboriginal communities experience. Shift your thinking to from a tokenistic gesture in terms of engagement and consultation, and shift it to something that can make your work, your policy, your approach augmented. That can augment your approach, that can augment your work, that can strengthen your approach, because
mm,
that's often what happens. And I think getting a clear understanding of purpose, for me, what's your what's the purpose of your work, or what's the purpose of your engagement and your approach? If your purpose comes from a point of view of supporting Aboriginal communities and pursuing their aspirations, or meeting their needs, then I think your approach should have to has to reflect that.
mm,
Sometimes I feel that the purpose is a bit garbled, which results in a tokenistic approach or
mm,
to consultation, or sometimes to consultation as an afterthought.
mm, mm,
Um, and then it's that Aboriginal communities probably have the opportunity to participate in a much more meaningful manner than just being a consultant. They can be people that they're landowners themselves. They're people with a distinct and innate understanding of country. So
mm,
look at them as industry leaders, or look at them as people that can, you know, assist you in the implementation of strategy as well. Um,
mm.
or
Absolutely.
that can lead the implementation of strategy, I should say, not just assist.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. Looked out communities as industry leaders. I think it's a great quote to take out of this. I think that's really sort of reinforces, I guess, a shift in the lens for how we view our communities, shifting away um, some of this engagement and journey for some people trying to understand this away from like a tokenistic sort of deficits lens sort of approach to, I guess really rebalancing how we perceive our communities as, um, as valid stakeholders in these journeys, um, in terms of cultural and community authority, in terms of subject matter experts, in terms of industry leaders, in terms of a whole range of different ways that we understand and look at our communities in terms of their role in stakeholder and community engagement and participation. So, um, yeah, I think that's been a really good theme from this yarn that we've been able to have. Um, and look, I think we've talked about a range of different things that I think are really valuable for people to take away. I guess if there's one thing right now you could give someone, whether it's like a book, a movie, some sort of a resource that you think could help them, on their on their cultural capability journey um, can be specific to the planning and environment space. Doesn't have to be. We've had a range of different examples throughout the different episodes. So whatever you sort, and I didn't give this to you in the brief either, so it's very much on the top of your head. But yeah, anything someone can sort of jot down as something they can take away.
In terms of resources, I mean, nothing comes at me off the top of my head except for Indigenous X. Like,
Hmm. Yeah,
that's
cool.
the source that I always go back to. But, I think just reading the various articles, it's not necessarily planning specific, but
Hmm.
they have a lot of commentary on a range of different matters. And what they do really well is actually um, seek out blackfellas that have a diverse range of opinions on a particular matter.
Hmm.
So the experience of their writers and their content is quite diverse, is quite unique, and it probably shows you the differing perspectives amongst blackfellas as well. And the common perspectives as well, because we're not divided. But
Hmm.
um, I think some of their articles are really provocative and thought-inducing, and you know, incredibly well written. So that's certainly a source that I would say lean into, just to give you a sense of how different matters affect us. So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. I think that's a great resource and one that many people listening probably haven't come across yet. And it's the first one. You're the first one in our guest series that suggested Indigenous X. So yeah, jump online, just give it a quick Google, it'll pull it up. They used to be really active on Twitter, now known as X. They're active on LinkedIn now as well, which is great. But there's a range of different platforms that you can use to engage with their content and like Sean said, really valuable broad sort of representation across a whole range of policy issues and community issues as well across the country. Look, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Sean. Thanks for taking the time to jump on and have a yarn about some of this sort of stuff. I think anyone listening is easily going to take away some critical things that they can think about, whether they can directly implement some of that sort of stuff or whether they can start to think about how they can advocate for a bit of a shift in terms of how their teams, workplaces, or organisations approach engagement with our communities is going to be really, really valuable. So, um, yeah, a wealth of knowledge that you've been able to try and capture in a pretty short podcast episode. And look, I hope to get you back on again in the future so we can maybe do a bit more of a deep dive around some of those things that you talked about in more detail. So you're a part of the impact policy family here now, so you're not too far away. So stay tuned for more from Sean McCarthy in the future. And any final words before we jump off?
no, just thanks for having me, bro. So it was really good to kick this off.
All right, deadly, bro. All right, thank you everyone for turning up, listening in, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Impact Planning Policy series. All right, catch ya.
All
Bye.
right.